Hi, this is David Douglas, Managing Director of EBO, the digital agency. EBO are the proud sponsors this year of RadioMoLI and MoLI's digital programme.
UCD has a particular focus on equality, diversity and inclusion. So we've come together with MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland, in this project called Past, Present and Pride. It's a way for us to work with, to interview, to hear the voices of LGBTI writers, Irish writers and perhaps some international writers, a way to give voice to the LGBTI experience, to advance issues of diversity, inclusion and equality. I'm Paul Dalton. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in UCD and I also work in St. Vincent's Hospital in Allen Park. So welcome to MoLI, welcome to Past, Present, Pride. I'm delighted to introduce Sean Hewitt today. Sean is our fifth guest in this series. So, Sean, without saying an awful lot more, let's start this conversation about your wonderful book that's just about to make its way into the world.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I know this is a special time because we're going to come to that. But your book is published in July.
In July, on the 14th of July, yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
And I think you have it.
This is it. Yeah,
hot off the presses.
Very hot off the press. It only arrived last week. This is the hardcover. So yeah, it's coming out in July, and I'm looking forward to it. It'll be a busy summer.
What's it like to have it in your hand?
Good. I mean, I didn't want to open it for a while. It was a bit scary because it's something that I guess has been in your head or on a computer screen for so long that to have it in physical form was both scary because I realized that it was real, but also it did have the effect of neutering some of the fears I had about this book, because I picked it up and I was like, oh, it's only a little book. You know, so that was good.
Some of the fears you had about it. What would tell me about that?
Well, I mean, it's a memoir and it's a very personal book. And so long as you're writing it, or it doesn't exist physically in the world or with readers, you can almost pretend to yourself that it's just your own piece of work. So knowing then that you have to let other people inside that book and you have to talk about it and you have to let readers make up their own minds about it, I suppose you have to give up control over it.
Sure.
So there's always a bit of nerves about that.
Yeah.
But there's something quite nice about when it's in physical form, it's done, I can't change it. So you have to freewheel your way through then, yeah.
I mean, I'm delighted because I think this is probably the first conversation about the book.
Yes.
So I feel really very honoured and I look forward to talking to you about the book. I read it and I don't read very quickly, but I read it over a weekend and couldn't quite put it down. So there's lots about the book that I want to talk to you about. You were born in Manchester, in the north of England.
Yeah, Warrington. It's just outside Manchester, between Manchester and Liverpool, about halfway in between them each. Okay. It's a small town, yeah.
With an Irish mum and an English dad.
Yeah.
And a very Irish grandmother, I believe.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, the whole family... my dad was only, there was only two of, he had a sister and my dad, whereas my mum is one of nine, a very Irish Catholic family who had come from Limerick. And so the vast majority of the family was Irish.
Okay.
So it just seemed very normal to me that everyone, had Irish accents or
had 9 brothers or sisters.
And then I guess it's only as you grow up that you realise that that's not the way everyone else is in the world. Yeah.
Did you spend time in Ireland as a child? Did you?
So I still have family in Limerick, and we used to go over for summers, usually in Dingle or Lahinch for summer holidays. So yeah, we used to go back into a lot of the time. But even at home, my grand's house is always the centre of the family unit, and Christmas was always rebel songs and whiskey, and it was very Irish enclave. Yeah. But actually, Warrington and Liverpool, there's a huge Irish population in them, so half your friends would have an Irish surname or something. And we were Catholic, and the Catholic church there that we used to go to had a quite big congregation, which wouldn't be typical in England, apart from some places that are have a history of migration, Irish migration.
What will your grandmother make of the book?
Well, I don't think she's going to read it, thankfully. It's one of these things that when I talk about the anxieties of the book as well, that does come into your head. But I remember very vividly, actually, my dad saying to me, if you worried about what any of us would think about it, you'd never write anything at all, which is quite a nice, liberating thing for a parent to say. So it just meant that I wrote this book speaking not with the shadow of a family member or of any sort of presumed judgment over me. I had to only speak to the book itself, and then hope that people meet it where I asked them to meet them. There is a lot of honesty in this book that I think would be, I don't know, shocking in the way that I now, having written the book, I have very little shame left about the things in the book. And I think in some ways being that honest with yourself for a long time really neuters the potential kind of pinpricks that these moments might have. And actually when you write it down, you're like, oh, okay. Yeah.
Something about giving it voice, and I hope it's something that we can come back to, because that kind of thread of shame is something I was very conscious of in reading your book and your poetry. And something, Sean, about the kind of giving voice to shame. That idea that shame loves secrecy. Shame blossoms when it's secret and when it's unspoken. So I was reading in you an articulation, a putting of words onto something that potentially could be very shaming and very silencing. So it's the almost antidote to that. Am I reading too much into?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, a large amount of the memoir is about lies. It's about the lies that you tell yourself as you grow up, or the lies you tell to other people in order to protect either yourself or them. And eventually, I think as I went through, I realized that I had invented this entire web of fictionality as a way of deflecting from shame in the book. And the memoir, in its most raw form, is a form of truth-telling. So the way of exercising all of the lies is to finally kind of put it out as an act of truth-telling. And so even though the book does circle around shame and it circles around lies, I hope it's also kind of liberatory by the end of it, in that it attempts to kind of confront lies and shame head on and to move past them. So those things haunt the book. But the aim of it was to kind of confront them and give a form to moving beyond them. Yeah.
And Sean, is creative memoir, is that a category, and is that what this is? Because you're clear towards the end, or at the end of the book, saying, look, some of these characters are kind of blended. And talk to me a little bit about that, about memoir and creativity.
Yeah. So I mean, in my head, I call this a sort of Gothic memoir, or a Gothic coming of age memoir. And the reason I think that adjective there, Gothic, is really important is because I wanted this book to have the quality. It is true on multiple levels. This is not only a book that is, true in a real life sense, but it also is true to my experience. And sometimes experience shifts reality into ways that appear untrue or supernatural. So in some of the experiences that I recount in the book, because I was under a lot of stress or was isolated, my mind made a Gothic world of the world that was real. So it only seemed right to me that I write a Gothic memoir. So you could read it in some ways as a creative text, and of course it is. It has to make a narrative out of life, and those two things are not easily joined together. You can't give all of the detail that you experienced in real life because it wouldn't fit into a book. Even the speaking voice of this book has to be one consistent version of myself, which is the writer version of myself, who can say certain things and have a certain intonation even. But I wanted this to slip through the factual realm of nonfiction and to create a sort of porous Gothic world in which ghosts might come back, or fragments of history that might also reflect what was going on in my mind at any given time. So there are moments in the book when the world, to me, becomes evil or Gothic or very uncanny. And I wanted to reflect that in your experience as a reader, so that you would feel yourself to be in perhaps a terrifying world, or perhaps a very dark world, perhaps a world in which the real has shifted into something else.
And I had several of those experiences reading it, which I'm dying to talk to you a little bit more about. Shown the idea of the kind of multiple selves. And this is my psychology 101. Growing up in the UK, in the north of England, Irish parents, you're an Irish citizen, you born and brought up in England. The kind of multiple identities, the movement from, I think you would describe as a working class, your dad, your dad was a what did you?
He was a joiner.
Yeah, he was a joiner. Your mum was a teacher. I was interested about how this Sean went from there to Cambridge. You tell me a little bit about that transition.
Yeah. I mean, I talk about it in the book, and I think one of the key reasons. I mean, I am not typical of my family in that way. My elder brother is a joiner too, and my younger brother is very sporty, which I'm not. And I channeled all of my energies into books and reading. And I think looking back, although this isn't all of it, but it might be part of an explanation, is that those were things that were rewarded by the world around me. And if I felt that I needed to fit into that world, or to cover something shameful up about me, the best way of doing that was to lean into everything that was praised in that world. So that became book learning, it became doing well in exams, it became being a good boy, you know. So all of those things kind of fed into a need, I think, to always be the best version of what was held up as a good person. So although I'm very grateful for it in some ways, and I did very much enjoy, going to Cambridge, reading a lot. I think that is also part of the reason why I was so intent on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And Sean, maybe if I just so that I kind of have that the kind of best little boy in the class, growing up gay, and all that means. So in needing to, and if I'm over-interpreting, please tell me, but needing to kind of secure, protect my place in the world.
Yeah.
So becoming the best little boy, mum's best little boy, whatever it might have been, that was some of your experience, not all of it.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about, in the book I use the metaphor of kind of building a sort of suit of armor to protect yourself, and that armor is given to you.
Yeah.
An education is a breastplate on the armor. The church is a shield, and you put it all on, and eventually you emerge out into adulthood, and you have to unpick the versions of you that you've built, and ask which bit was given to me and which bit was my own. And the book moves towards a point at which, towards the end, it's not really a spoiler, but I'm looking at a photograph of myself when I was 5 or 6 years old. And in the polarization of that moment, I am two selves, and I'm looking across the 20-odd years at another version of myself, and we're confronting each other. Where did you go, and who are you?
Yeah.
And attempting to kind of reconcile those two things, or to bring more of that uncorrupted version of yourself into the present again, is part of the liberation that the book tries to put forward. So what might it mean for us to recreate ourselves in our own image rather than in someone else's image? That was one of the key questions of the book. And in writing a memoir, what I found was interesting about the form of it was that they're often quite linear and looking forward narratives. We get through something and then we are released into something at the end. Whereas actually what I realized that I couldn't be looking forward without going all the way back. So it was an act of recovery as much as anything else. So it wasn't an act of rebuilding or overcoming and going forward. It was an act of picking up versions from the past as well.
Yeah. I mean, it struck me as an act of psychological integration, not to sound too grand about it, but a real act of integration. You mentioned in that the kind of the uncorrupted version, or I'm wondering about the corrupting influences.
Yeah.
What were the influences that corrupted?
Well, I mean, you overhear a lot as a child. One of the key questions that I had in this book was, how did I pick up a number of signals from the culture which taught me things that I was never directly taught? So how did I pick up that it was not a good idea to be gay? Or how did I pick up the sense of reactions to it when I hadn't myself tested that reaction? And this was one of the key questions. In the book does a number of deep dives, and at one point I go back to my childhood. And, I remember, for example, when Will Young won Pop Idol. And this is one of the things that I guess I wouldn't have remembered had I not thought it was significant to me at the time. But he won, and then he came out. And everyone was talking about it. I was only about 6 or 7. Everybody was saying, well, were we hoodwinked into voting for him? Would we have voted for him if we knew the other Gareth Gates should have won instead, and all of this? So you pick up the messaging of what will happen when you come out. You're the source of gossip. The idea is that you have perhaps tricked everyone, that you're an inherently deceptive person, and that people will be angry. So even as a 6-year-old, you register that and you pick it up. So I think that's just one example of how the messaging starts to happen. And because of that, you begin to construct your lie. You begin to fictionalize yourself. And you can't fully do that. That's not something I think that can never be entirely successful, because you've got another self in there bashing against the wall wanting to come out. So you build this fictional version of yourself in the full knowledge that at some point you will have to dismantle that. And we might think of coming out as a way of dismantling or leaving behind. But I don't think it's that easy. I think you come out, you give up the fictionality, but you find that actually you're still acting the part of your earlier self. It's not that easy to unpick the two versions. And so I think one of the tasks of adult life then for me has been to more completely unpick that version, so that I might get to a place where I have reached some less corrupted version of myself, and to gain power over what that self is. So I guess that's what I mean by an uncorrupted and corrupted self. And the reason that the book goes back in time and has this kind of psychological voyaging into the darkness is to get to a place eventually where things are unpicked enough to start again, or to have undone some things, or in terms of the ghosts in the book, to have exorcised some of those ghosts. Yeah.
And Sean, in the kind of historical context that you've grown up in, that we're a part of, I'm thinking about your work with the National Library in the Queer Archive. You were the first poet in residence.
That's right.
Have I got that right?
Yeah.
And how some of that work is about unpicking, uncorrupting, reclaiming stories, lives, lived experience. And I think we probably can't have that conversation today without remembering the men who were killed in Sligo. Aidan Moffat and Michael Sneen a month ago.
Yes, not long ago at all. And there's only just last week, I think, two queer women were attacked in Dublin, just near the George. The archival research is strange in some ways, and I do some archival research in the book too. I look at the Warrington Guardian, the local newspaper, because that's what I would have read. That's another source of kind of cultural messaging that I would have picked up.
Yeah.
And actually, you don't have to go that far back in time to reach a very unsettling world. In this book, 2005, 2006 are some of the articles I'm looking for, which doesn't seem to me, at least, to be a great deal of time ago. And you have, perverts, and you have, this sort of language of people being arrested, and all that. And you pick that up. One thing I find looking at the Irish Queer Archive is, and actually how anxiety-inducing it can be to confront certain things in that history, because you read it and it starts to unlock certain things in your head, but also you're reading about people just like you, or similar enough to you, that have been treated in all sorts of ways because of that commonality. So you begin to, I was working in there all across the summer, and there were some days where I had to stop halfway through and just go for a walk because I thought it was a bit much, and I hadn't expected that even just something as apparently academic as sitting in a library and looking into manuscripts might begin to make you tremble. And it did. It made me. It did begin to unpick me in a way that I wasn't prepared for. And the nice thing is when you get to rewrite it, and that is, without sounding egotistical, there is something nice about being given a received narrative and then turning it around and writing it back.
You certainly mentioned in the past the murder of David Flynn in 1982.
Declan Flynn.
Declan Flynn,
yeah.
excuse me, Declan Flynn in 1982, and how influential reading about that in the archive is, and how that has shaped certainly some of your poetry.
Yeah.
I think is that the case?
Yeah. So I had written this series of poems, 10 poems based on the archival material, and a couple of them are about Declan Flynn's murder, which could be said to have precipitated the Pride, the first Dublin Pride or protest or march. I have one poem entirely in the voice of his killers, and then one in Declan and Declan's family's voice. And the way I had done it was to use phrases from the newspaper and court proceedings, so to let the killers speak and then to let the family speak. But I think he's one of these figures that, again, haunts Dublin or the Irish queer imagination. There's a brilliant photograph in the Zurich Portrait Prize at the moment by Brian Teeling. It's called Declan Flynn in Dublin, but it's just a portrait of the empty bench. What's left of him is his absence, that he's not there. And I think that absence does haunt a community, and more recent absences too. Yeah. And so it seems very real to me that we might confront these things through a Gothic mode, through a sense of the supernatural, because it doesn't seem to me to be an unreal in the sense of how we live our lives. We're very aware of these absences. We're very aware of these ghostly figures that might, but for different circumstances, have been us, and I think that we're constantly given these sets of warnings and these crises, and the reason that those can shatter an entire community is because they really hit to the heart of what might be terrifying at any given time.
And your poetry as a way to give voice, to make sense, to immortalize, to around many of these issues, and the life and death of your father. I know that your volume of poetry was very closely associated when your dad got very sick and died. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Dad died in 2019, the year before Tongues of Fire, my first collection, came out. But I had signed the contract for the book on the day that he died. He did know it was coming out because the contract took a while before it came through. But it had this weird, it was almost like, when someone in a family dies and then you have this birth of someone else, and often people kind of think about it in those terms. The book was very closely related to his death, and in fact I rewrote the final section of the book to be about Dad's illness and death. And I guess to me, sometimes the function of writing is to hold in place something that otherwise slips through time, and also to work it out into a new way. So for me, at least, and other readers have told me as well, those poems become vessels for past people to live in. So I have people who've read them whose, friends or mothers or whatever have died, and they can read the poems and situate their mother inside that poem, or their uncle, or their brother, or whatever it is. So they become kind of holding spaces in that way. And I think often written works of literature become those kind of stops in time, or moments of places to work through and reflect on things.
Born out of loss, born out of deep loss and deep suffering. And I've heard you say somewhere else about, I hope I have this right, but that you're learning to forgive the poems. You're a number of years later.
I mean, I think it's interesting. I have said that. I must have forgiven them because I can't now remember what they'd done wrong. But I guess what they had done wrong is the fact of their birth was out of a very difficult time. And I guess again with All Down Darkness Wide as well, it is a book that has to hold a certain amount of yourself if it's to be any good. And without being too vampiric about the whole thing, I have to suffer in some ways again to rewrite these things. But I wouldn't do it did I not think that they would be useful. And likewise with the poems too. My instinct when going through something that I can't process, or a time that seems to be already moving into the past, in that way that you become very conscious sometimes of time always going forward, or the passage of time, is to memorialize it in some way, and to hope that would be useful.
And there is a sense, I think, isn't there, of creating some sort of a form of chronology, a form of emotional, psychological kind of movement or stages when it comes to grief, putting some kind of shape on that.
I mean, putting form onto something, or at least pulling things into meaning, can be quite liberatory in some ways, because you don't have to live in this fibrous mess in which things don't always seem to make sense. I found when writing the memoir that there were days when I was I was traveling back in time in my head and finding moments that suddenly connected to other moments. So lying as a teenager to friends at school, I used to spread rumors about myself that I'd kissed girls, just so the rumor would spread and I'd be safe for a little bit longer. Then led up to me lying later on in the story as an adult to friends or to my boyfriend or to my parents, and you realize that these things don't come out of nowhere. You know, I've taken refuge in fiction, my own fictions, too many times, and there gets to be a point at which you can no longer tell the truth because you've wrapped yourself up in too many layers of fiction. So I guess one of the hopes of the book and in narrativizing everything is to free not only myself from the fictions, but also in the hope that if a reader reads it, they might themselves feel freed by the acknowledging of those fictions.
Yeah, I think so. And a kind of an unraveling, personally, an unraveling of aspects or pieces of my own fiction or life, or an unraveling of that by listening, hearing, experiencing someone else's story, and the idea that the past is never very far away from us. I think again, it's one of those themes I've noticed in the book is that every childhood lasts a lifetime. The impact of all of those formative experiences have shape and continue to shape. And putting words on them maybe is a way, as you say, is a way to untangle.
Yeah, I mean, you know, on the cover of the book we have the two. These are two of the four disgraces, they're called. These are characters from classical myths, and you can see them both falling here. One of them has fallen off the chariot, another one out of a tree, and they have this kind of tumbling motion. And the more I look at it, the less I think of the disgrace of the fall, and the more of a kind of freedom in the tumbling. And in the book, you know, I tumble back in time often towards the child. But it's not just to go back. It's also about the retrieval, the journey back out. I was thinking a lot about these journeys to the underworld. I make a little joke about it in the beginning, where I'm holding my phone up in a graveyard, and I say it's like my golden bow, like Aeneas uses to go into the underworld and to come back. And the most important thing is the coming back. So I wanted to tumble back into childhood and then way beyond, 150 years ago, longer, via these ghosts, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Corin Boyer, and to bring something back, to say, what can I... It's always got to be worth the going down. So the going down might be harrowing, but what makes it worth it is that I can bring something back. So there might be some sort of talisman or lesson or bit of light that I bring back to the surface. So the book, it has this basically year-long overarching narrative. And then at various points it tumbles back in time in search of a sort of light or lesson. And often the person waiting at the end of that tumbling is the little boy, and the little boy can teach you a lot more than you think.
And tell me something about moving from poetry to memoir, from relatively few words to lots and lots of words.
Yeah.
Tell me about that. Why the move? And I guess there'll be a move back, and you know.
Yes,
but
yeah.
Tell me about that.
I wanted to make use of story and to really sink you as a reader into an atmosphere that I didn't think that poetry necessarily could. Poetry can be very good at being elliptical or minimal or suggesting things without necessarily giving everything away. But I wanted you to know while reading this book that it was real, that it happened, the reasons for it, and also to be able to talk at length about those things. And I began to be very excited by the world building that you can do in a prose book. And suddenly you can walk all the way through that world, and you can pick things up, and you can tumble back in time, and you can go across continents and centuries, and you can really rove through it, and you can take a reader by the hand and walk them through it. And that was something I had never done in the poems. I had never had, as a sort of adventure or a sort of voyage, and I can take you with me and show you something, and I can terrify you, and I can disturb you, and then I can comfort you, and I can show you these beautiful things, and then I can show you why things happened. It felt like something that I just really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed being able to build a world and to move around in it.
And you do move the reader around. We move we move continents.
Yeah.
And I was really struck by the natural world, the seasonality, and again, not to give too much away, but the seasonality that in some ways I thought mirrored maybe your internal psychological world. So again, not giving too much away, but we're in South America.
Yeah.
So we go from South America to Sweden, and the changing light, the changing temperature, the amount of daylight. I think I found myself kind of carried by that, in a very inquisitive, almost visceral kind of way. So when we're in Sweden for a lot of the time, there's 3 or 4 hours of light during the day, in direct contrast to when we're in South America, and all those very beautifully and sensually written scenes that involve water, which I really wanted to ask you something about as well. But so tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, that is how it happened. And, it begins with, there is a romance in the book that is sunshine and tans and, drinking by the beach and all of that. And when we move to Sweden in the book, the winter comes in at the same time as depression begins to pull through the book. And in some ways that was confusing to me as it happened in real life, because you hear a lot of people talk about kind of seasonal depression. And I began to think, I wonder if that is it. But very quickly, the darkness began to mirror my own mood and situation. I think of it almost as, it's like The Shining or something. That you become more isolated, you become darker, things start to slip out of the real, and you're isolated in a country you don't know, with only one other person, and everything begins to slip. The point there is that outside is hostile and cold. And there were moments when I lived there that I used to walk out at night when I was trying to come to terms with quite a big trauma. And I talk in the book about ghosting myself or pretending that I don't exist, wandering around these woods. And yeah, the sense of encroaching darkness was enveloping to me. And so I wanted, by turn, to envelop you. I wanted you to feel claustrophobic. I wanted you to feel cold, dark, isolated. And I also needed to give you the feeling of what that polar opposite is like. Because you need to feel the sun and the heat and the freedom for you to fully realize what was lost or what is missing. And had I just plunged you straight into the darkness, it may have been too much. And you also perhaps wouldn't have realized what it was that had been lost or where we were trying to get back to. So yeah, the seasonality of the book was important in that way. It does mirror the mental states. And that, as I said, is both real and just happily a sort of pathetic fallacy.
And John, the seasonality of relationships, is that there?
Yes,
is that reflecting that too?
Yeah, I think the seasonality of life in some way. You know, this is a book that, although the key narrative is a relationship I had for 5 years or so in the middle of my 20s, the majority of my adult life up until that point. And thank you. And this seasonality is important because when you first fall in love, the world is sunny, you know, especially when it's kind of your first boyfriend and you have this wave of romance. And also as a young person, or at least I probably still am, very given over to romanticism. It was all ideals, it was all romance. It was someone else could cure everything about the world. And it would often be experienced like that too. I would often feel very changed by other people. And the flip side of that is that when things don't go well for someone else, you're dragged straight into it because you've attached your happiness and sadness to someone else. And so, yeah, these very turbulent seasons that the relationship has in the book are a sort of codependency in the way that I am merged into other people. And there's an attempt of recovery as well to pull myself back out of that. Yeah.
And do you think, or maybe I've often thought that and we touched on this earlier on, but the kind of identity formation, you know, these kind of classic psychological stages that we're supposed to go through. I think there's a lot of validity in them, to be honest, but the kind of identity formation that at some point in our kind of late teens, early 20s, mid-20s, we were expected to form a relatively stable identity. I don't mean one that suffocates or that's binary, no. Yeah. But I think that as LGBTI plus people I think that gets delayed. And it takes us a little bit longer, maybe even a decade or so longer, to get some of that identity formation in place. Does that make it?
I think that seems about right to me. I think as an adolescent, you undergo a lot of your identity formation as a LGBTQ plus person, either in hiding or you make two, as I've said, or more than two. And it's only over your 20s, perhaps, that you begin to test out the real one and to begin to figure out what it is. And often as well, the identity is formed, I think, in isolation from other people. So one of the things I talk about in the book is this seeming miracle to me that I wasn't alone. You know, this discovery that, I didn't have to figure it all out by myself, although I have done. And then to realize that, everyone else figured it out to this point too. You know, everyone went through turmoil, coming out, doing, finding their way around. And you think that you've invented it all on your own, and then you realize you haven't. But it seems to me that really it's only at the end of the book that I begin to confront the idea of, I call it self-making in the book, and I talk about what it would be to make a self. And that's at the age of 28, 29, and it was a key pressing question for me at that age. What do I do now? And the consciousness of it, I think, is important too, because it's not something that was an organic process that was done in community with other people. So very self-consciously, there was a moment of my life where I had to think, right, how do I build a person? Which is a very odd thing to have to think your way through.
And Sean, not to be too cliched about it, but it takes a village. We don't achieve that sense of identity in isolation. It's only done through community. I really do believe. And I think that's some of the motivation for this work that we're doing, for these series of conversations. Because that is about creating awareness, conversations, context for other people emerging into the world. That there is a template. There's I'm not alone. I'm not. It's very
I mean, there are cliches, but people often say, write the book you wish you could have read, or the book that you needed. And I had never read this book, so I set out to write it. And I hope that even just in doing that, you give a template, or you give just a hand held out to someone else, or a common understanding, and that might be enough.
I wish it was around when I was a late teenager or young. I wish this was around then. As a guide, as another way. Like the only guide or the only nod that I had was there was a gay character in EastEnders, and that was it. No one. I mean, that was it. So these books, I think, provide a pathway, a guide for lots of people.
Yeah, I hope so.
You, as we move towards a close, I went down a complete rabbit hole, the Gerard Manley Hopkins rabbit hole, and when people read your book, they'll know why. Because Gerard Manley Hopkins, to my mind, is probably one of the most central characters in the book.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned him, and you've alluded to or mentioned to mystery, to what's not seen.
Yeah.
And I have to say that we're in Newman House on St. Stephen's Green.
Yeah.
And Gerard Manley's bedroom and office is actually next door.
Yeah.
You know this.
Yeah.
And he died in this building at 47 years of age. He was appointed professor of Greek and Latin, I believe, when UCD was beginning its life. So Gerard Manley Hopkins is all around us. I'm really interested to know why he's so important to you.
Yeah, so he appears as one of these, I call them a chosen family of ghosts in the book, and he's kind of the daddy of my chosen family of ghosts that appear. And you wouldn't have to know anything about Hopkins to read the book. He kind of appears as a real enough ghost. And the title, All Down Darkness Wide, is taken from one of his poems. And that seemed to capture the idea of, in the poem, a man is walking with a lantern through the night, and you can see it swinging, and Hopkins is asking where he's going. So it seemed to capture some of that kind of historical sweep of the book. He's a person I've always been fascinated by. He was a poet and a priest. He was also, I don't know what label would be best to give him. It would appear to me he was a gay man. He has written some very frank diaries, which I have impertinently used here. And yeah, he becomes in the book a sort of guiding figure for me. Someone who can articulate things that I have felt sometimes before I felt them or as I'm feeling them. He also brings in the key question, or one of the key questions of the book, which is religion and sexuality. He is tortured by the opposition between these two things. And you can see it coming up again and again in his diary, the sense of shame, of self-harm that he goes through. So I call him up in the book as a way of seeking guidance, as a way of turning to someone who's been there before me. We talk about books that we wish had been there. He was one of the people that was there for me. So I call him up into the book as a sort of from beyond the grave to talk to us. So perhaps he's listening. Maybe he's not happy.
Would he approve?
I doubt it. No, I've given away all his secrets. No, he maybe would. Maybe he'd forgive me now. I've always felt very close to him. In that very strange way that when you read the work of a writer or perhaps a musician, you listen to music or a poem, and you almost feel that they know you, and in turn you know them. Yeah. It's a fantasy that nevertheless is very real. Yeah. And I've always felt in some way that were his ghost to appear, he would already know who I was. Because I feel that I have this closeness to him. As characters in a memoir go, he's as real to me as as other people. So yeah.
And that kind of tension between religion, the mysterious, the mystical, sexuality, shame, that I think you capture beautifully on the part of Hopkins, and in some ways your own pull or tension in those areas.
Yeah. I mean, in the book, so there is a long sequence in where I go on the pilgrimage to Lourdes, and there is a a moment at which I have an encounter with a closeted priest as well. And it also opens in a graveyard with a church looming over me. The church is something, when I thought of retrieval, I thought of this kind of time-traveling treasure hunt of the book. They had something I wanted to steal back under cover of darkness, which was God or spirituality. I wasn't ready to let them take it. So there are a kind of this Lord sequence in the book ends with me stealing God and running away with him. So and that is quite true for me in some ways, because Hopkins is, and I think I love about Hopkins's writing is that he makes the world seem magical. You know, everything is. He has this brilliant line that I quote in the book where he says that if you touch the world rightly, kind of drops fire and rings and tells of God. And I didn't think it was fair that only the church could have that world. So that is another thing that I steal back in order to make.
I really felt you do that in the book, a reclaiming, an uncorrupting of the human impulse, the human draw towards mystery. And if we loads more time, I'd love to talk to you about ritual as well, the kind of mystery and ritual. You know, I have thought, and I've kind of said before, that the awful brutality that we as a nation of people have experienced, many people have experienced at the hands of the Catholic Church. I do think that one of the real tragedies in all of that is that mystery, ritual, the mystical has been maybe temporarily taken away from us. And I'm always interested when I see artists, actively reclaiming. And that makes me very happy. And that's what I...
So I wanted to steal it back. It had always been something that I was fascinated by, even as a child. Ritual, incense, singing. I love church music. I love hymns. I love the Bible. I like the cadence of the Bible and the stories of the Bible. And I think that it's wrong to say that we can't pick and choose. I'm quite happy to pick and choose. I pick and choose all the time, and part of the book is a picking and choosing. And I pick the things that I want: mystery, ritual, a sort of enchanted natural world, a reverence. The sacred, and I take them, and I leave the shame and the rules behind.
You do, you do, and you, to my mind, you give a permission for other people to do the same thing.
I hope so.
You talk and you write beautifully about that occasion in Lourdes when you were there as a young man. And taking a bath in the holy water in Lourdes, and I think you also wrote about Gerard Manley Hopkins. Well, certainly, or at least I read as a schoolboy, he'd go to the ponds in Hampstead Heath. And really, he describes, I think, in a couple of different places, how that experience for him was one, in some cases, erotic and deeply spiritual.
Yeah.
So something about water, and then you commented in the book, and I had to go and have a look at it. You said something about how the Jesuit novices were when they had a bath, that the water was coloured to protect their modesty.
Modesty powder.
Modesty powder.
They used to put it in the bath, modesty powder. There's a poem that Hopkins wrote, and it was one of his last poems, so it's interesting because you talk about him swimming on Hampstead Heath as a young man, and one of the last poems he writes is called Epithalamium, a marriage poem. But it's not at all about marriage in the traditional sense. It's all of these boys swimming in the water. And he spends ages, like all this luscious detail of their bodies flinging into the water in the sunlight. And it ends with a series of questions. It's not a finished poem, but one of them is, what is water? Spousal love. So it's the thing that connects all the bodies of the men in the pond. It's their way of touching each other. It's something that is sustaining, but kind of unfelt. So he has this way of turning the homoerotic through the water into something holy, almost a sacrament of the men swimming together. And I always think it's quite nice that that's one of his last poems, because it seems to be a quite hopeful writing of the homoerotic, or this sense of peace with other men. But yeah, there's something odd. I mean, one of the reasons that bathing in the baths at Lord's stuck in my head is because, as a teenager, they make you get completely naked, which you're just not used to doing. And then they wrap you in this sheet, and you're in there naked with two men wrapping this translucent sheet around you, and what could be more, I mean, if they weren't 80-year-old priests, I mean, what could be more homoerotic under different circumstances? But you're naked, you're very vulnerable, you're very aware of your own body. There's this cold water, and people are saying kind of rhythmic prayers in Latin around you. And it's a very haunting sort of experience, and it's a very austere stone bath. And I remember mainly this process of going through one curtain, being asked to undress, and they put a sheet around you, and then you go through another one and they swap your sheet into something almost translucent because it's like wet white cotton. And it stuck with me because like it would, the mix of the vulnerable, the body, the naked body, and the church all together.
So, full disclosure here. So I was that boy too. At I think maybe 15, in the same baths in Lourdes, and my absolute fear was that I'd have an erection. That was what that was.
I mean, it is a very. Because it has all the tenor of almost a gym changing room in there. And you're just filed through with loads of naked men. And we should go back.
We
can reclaim that as well.
Exactly. Let's reclaim that one. As we move towards an end, You wrote at the time of your dad's death that I think you said you would have given all the poems away to bring him back, and in the book you write really movingly about how I think the only thing that he wanted was to sit in the garden with his boys. And listen to the bird song. I mean, what a man.
Yeah, no, it was in Dublin. He was on the phone to me when he said that. You can't give things to get people back. For all the talk that I've just made about running into the underworld, Aeneas goes down into the underworld to save Semele? To bring someone back, to recover a soul. Christ going down into hell to bring souls back. You give up one thing and you get a soul back. You can't do that. That is something that only exists in the supernatural realm in the book. And so, perhaps in some ways it's easy for me to say what I would give up to have someone back because I can't get them back. But I think as a consolation, to have them almost living in the imagination, and to free them to live in the imagination of however many people who didn't know them, is quite a nice afterlife. Yeah, I could give.
He was very clear about what brought him contentment, happiness. It strikes me, and what he kind of wanted most. What about you?
Peace.
World peace.
Yes, peace and being outside. I love to be outside. If I had my choice, I would throw all the computers away and the phones. I would sit outside. I'm quite happy with a small number of things now. A few friends, a bit of peace and stability. I think as a younger person, I wanted big change and adventures and all this sort of thing. I've seen where that gets me, so I'm quite happy for a bit of peace now. Yeah.
I really wish you the very best with the writing way into the future.
Thank you.
And I look forward to reading you into the future.
Thanks.
And with the book launch and all the real life events that are going to happen, which is wonderful. I'm delighted it's happening. And a very big thank you from my colleagues in UCD, at EDI, and from our wonderful colleagues here in the wonderful MoLI. We will, and I hope this is okay, but I'd love you to read a little something in Gerard Manley Hopkins from his study, from his bedroom.
I would love that.
Can we do that?
Yeah,
maybe we can knit that in. But for now, a very big and a very sincere thank you from
Thanks so
us
much
all.
for having me. It was a pleasure.
A pleasure.
Thanks, Paul.
So, Sean, here we are in the room of one of the central characters in your book. The bedroom, the study of Gerard Manley Hopkins in Newman House on St. Stephen's Green. You're going to read something from in his honour. Yes.
Well, I thought that since we're in the room of a poet priest who was closeted, I might read a small section in which I meet another closeted priest. Back home, in my room, I felt vulnerable and alone. The orange glow of the street lamps outside my window spread over the ceiling, and the shadows of people walking along the pavement elongated over the white plaster. As the people passed, the black forms shrunk and clustered across the cornicing until they vanished and were gone. I lay under the covers, freezing, the draft of a breeze cluttering the shutters occasionally, and my nose wet with the cold. My bed leant against a boarded-up chimney breast, and inside I could hear voices echoing above from the flats, carrying through the hollow passages of the building, laughing, then silence, then again a voice. I did what I always did that year when I was alone and heart sore. took out my phone and tried to find someone to prise the light back in. Scrolling through the bright screen of photographs, messages buzzing through, I felt connected and desired. Eventually, I found a man who wanted to come over. He was short, older than me, with dark hair and bright grey eyes and an odd innocence I couldn't place. When I opened the door of the building, he barely met my gaze, just ducked past me and hurried into the flat. He was furtive, like a man on the run, a man being watched. I closed the heavy blue door and clicked the latch, pointed him to the door of my room, which was ajar, and watched as he went inside. I had barely seen his face. When I followed him into the room, he was standing by the bed and walked across to me. He hardly spoke. When I leant my face to his, at first he was quiet, then urgent, utilitarian. There was a sense of frustration and necessity to his movements, his hurried undressing, the lack of even friendly conversation or the forced banter I was used to. Straight afterwards, he got up to wash, standing over the sink in the bathroom and splashing water over his face and neck and hands like a bird shivering itself clean. I could see him through the frosted glass of the bathroom door, which swung open on its hinge behind him. After he was done, he looked up at me, meeting my gaze. In a hushed voice, quite serious, he told me that he was in training for the priesthood. The priest who carried out home visits here, who I spoke to sometimes in the building's communal garden, was his mentor. The priest's car, an old duck-egg Fiat, was parked near the entrance. The man needed to be invisible, to get outside without being seen. I nodded my understanding and scanned the hallway before I gave him the signal that no one was outside. By the door, he checked his pockets. Keys, wallet, presbytery keys, then left. Had he really just said that? I stood there, quietly stunned, as the latch clicked back into place. It was as though I had met a different version of myself. I felt sad, then comforted. There, walking off into the night, turning the key in his car and driving away, was a man I had escaped from being. But there was also a man who had not escaped.
Thank you. Thank you very much. For me, literature, for me, writers, for me, the arts, in some ways, capture what's often missed in conversation, what's often missed historically when it comes to the lives of people who, for various reasons in this country and beyond, don't experience an equal world, a world that is accommodating, is embracing of diversity, and certainly a world that isn't inclusive. So I feel the arts and literature play a very, very central and important role in advocating for a more equal, a more just, a more diverse and inclusive society.
RadioMoLI.